J.D. Vance, from never Trump to full MAGA. Welcome to Columbus on the Record. J.D. Vance once called Donald Trump cultural heroin. Vance said he was a never Trump guy. Then Vance ran for his U.S. Senate, said he had Trump all wrong. He got his endorsement, won the primary, then won the seat. Now as senator, his pro-Trump rhetoric in tone has grown more strident and harsh. Take this example from ABC's This Week when he was asked if he would have allowed Congress to consider fake electors designed to give the 2020 election to Donald Trump.
Would you have certified the election results had you been vice president?
If I had been vice president, I would have told the states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and so many others that we needed to have multiple slates of electors, and I think the U.S. Congress should have fought over it from there. That is the legitimate way to deal with an election that a lot of folks, including me, think had a lot of problems in 2020. I think that's what we should have done.
So it's very clear you would have done what Donald Trump asked you to do there, not what Vice President Mike Pence did. You said that that's about the past, but of course it's Donald Trump. That's what you just said.
It's not about what Donald Trump asks somebody to do. It's about what do we do when you have a problem like what happened in 2020.
Later in the week, at a news conference denouncing the failed border Ukraine aid compromise, Vance used the term bull bleep, minus the bleep, and he again put that word, minus the bleep, in a headline of a press release that his office sent out. Gene Krebs, he kind of ran with Trump in the last year's primary and then the election, but when he joined the world's most deliberative body, so-called, I think there was some thought that he might tone it down, be a quieter Trump supporter, but that's not the case.
No, I think it's important for us to remember that Donald J. Trump Sr. has broken all the norms in politics and indeed much of society, and has established a new norm, which is there are no norms. And that's why I think you're seeing from J.D. Vance, who, is actively, not actively, but there's a lot of stuff going on about him seeking the vice presidential nod. Just as, and I know if anybody's watching this right now, don't take a drink when I say this, okay, is that if Donald Trump is really going to keep busting all the norms, he's not going to have J.D. Vance or Elise Stefanik be his running mate. He'll have Donald Trump Jr. be his running mate.
Brian, Trump won Ohio by 8 points twice. J.D. Vance won by basically 8 points. So you could argue that J.D. Vance is just reflecting his Ohio constituents.
Well, at this point, a number of former Congress people have said this is really not the Republican Party. This is the cult of Trump is what is going on right now. Part of it has to do with the polling and where the polling is right now. If Donald Trump's polling ever just starts to implode, you're going to see these very same people do exactly what J.D. Vance's original position was. But there's no question he's pandering to be vice president. And this isn't about the American people. It's not about American issues. It's about who can favor Donald Trump more on the Republican side. And it's a little scary during a political discourse that it's not really about people, it's not really about issues, it's about one person.
We saw in 2022, yes, Josh Mandel trying very hard to get Donald Trump's endorsement. He kind of went a little too far when he tried to square off with Mike Gibbons on that debate stage. Reportedly, Trump was turned off by that. Can you go too far, do you think, Laura, in trying to gain the former president's favor?
I don't know. I don't know if you can go too far, but I think that Brian's right that, I'm sorry, it was Gene who said that a lot of these norms have been broken. The question is whether or not Donald Trump can break all the norms and he still remains really powerful and popular within the Republican Party. Can, lower level, senators and mayors and governors, can they do the same thing and be as outlandish, perhaps, as Donald Trump and still win his favor? I don't know.
Andrew, is this the only way for a Republican right now to advance in his or her party is to basically play to that pro-Trump crowd?
So if you follow the U.S. Senate race that's happening right now, that certainly, you can often just kind of evaluate what the politicians think they need to do is basically watching what they do and say. And you have Frank LaRose and Bernie Moreno who are kind of towing this line. And so, yeah, I think that's the calculation that they make. And kind of as an observer, I assume they know what they're talking about. So that's that's certainly a fair conclusion. Yeah.
Look at Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma. He was the one who sort of negotiated this deal that went nowhere. His party in Oklahoma is, trying to kick him out. I mean, they're asking him to resign. They want to, and he's a Baptist minister,
Yes.
far-right Republican,
Yes.
who just tried to strike a deal that most Democrats hate on immigration.
It kind of throws a wet blanket over the idea of doing policy in the U.S. Senate, much less Congress. But I think it has to go back to, you have to always remember that Trump owns 75% of the Republican vote. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because that 75% is intensely loyal to him. The other 25%, and you saw that from the exit polling for those who voted for Nikki Haley, will not vote for him under any circumstance, primarily due to January 6th. And because of that I think leads long-term. But so here's a problem for my party. If Trump's on the ballot, the party's split. If Trump, for whatever reason, is not on the ballot, then how do we get the Trumpians to come to the polls without him being on the ballot? We are now used to, and we count on them showing up. We're in a real, everybody thinks, oh, we're in the driver's seat. I think we're in a real difficult box.
Well, you look at the polls, Brian, and head-to-head in Ohio, Trump still wins against Joe Biden. And national polls, granted it's still early, it's only February, but Trump is neck and neck, if not leading in many of the key states.
I do think there is a tendency to do that. I think that the polls accurately reflect where he is, but I also think Democrats have to adjust their messaging. I mean, you've got to give people a reason to vote against Donald Trump. You can't insult, especially independent voters that voted for him. You have to tell them, okay, you voted this way, but this is why you can't vote that way anymore. But if you're just telling people he's awful, and going down that road, you're just going to turn people off, and that's been a problem for the party.
But Joe Biden's not the messenger. For 40 years, Joe Biden has set my teeth on edge consistently, and he's done that for a whole lot of folks, and he is still doing it now. And now you have legitimate claims about his mental competency, like the president of Assisi is president of Mexico, that type of stuff.
I think Donald Trump makes the same thing.
He does make the same thing. I'm not arguing that,
Yeah.
but they're not going to readily vote for Biden.
All right. If you watch local news, live sports, or Jeopardy, you know that the race for U.S. Senate is heating up. That's where the campaigns and their supporting PACs are flooding TV commercial spots with ads. The most eye-popping number this week comes from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's supporting groups. They say they plan to spend $83 million to defeat Sherrod Brown in November. Of course, Ohio Republicans have to pick Brown's opponent first. The three candidates are State Senator Matt Dolan, Secretary of State Frank LaRose, and Cleveland businessman Bernie Moreno. Andrew Tobias, there is a big difference between money promised to be spent in February and money actually spent in September. But $83 million, that's a big number. What's the message they're trying to send there?
So like you said, they could potentially pull this back. It's not set in stone, but so we've had a conversation in our newsroom about that. I personally think that they're very likely to spend this amount. I can't imagine there being other races that will be more important to Republicans than Ohio, because it's one of three currently Democratic-held states in states that Trump won. And so it's just a very good pickup opportunity for them. And for Democrats, it'll be important for the same reason. So we'll kind of see how the map kind of plays out as the year goes on. But it's a huge number. It's more than twice as much as they spent helping J.D. Vance in 2022 when he needed money. And 2022 is a record expensive year for Ohio Senate elections. And it certainly looks like we're on that path again this time.
Will it be enough, Laura? $83 million? That's a lot of money. That's not even counting what the candidate himself would be, Moreno, LaRose, or Dolan, will raise and spend.
Yeah, I think Andrew's right. This is going to be a record-setting year. And it's interesting because, Ohio is really no longer a presidential bellwether or swing state, but we're definitely going to see that money and the outside money surging in this Senate race. It is a good pickup opportunity. Ohio's been trending red, and I think Sherrod Brown is really going to have to fight to keep his seat.
So, Brian, which candidate does he want to face? Does he want to face Bernie Moreno, who's not as well known? Certainly not as well known as Frank LaRose.
I think he's going to raise money and run on his own record. So there are two issues, in fact, here. This isn't really a primary race. This is a race over who gets the rose from Donald Trump. Right now, Moreno has it. Right now, LaRose has the thorns, and he wants it. And, who knows what, Dolan's going to get or not get. But the point of all this is that the same way that Metzenbaum was able to win when Reagan was on the ballot, Sherrod's going to raise a lot of money. He already is raising a lot of money. But he's going to need to have some ticket splitters, especially among those independent voters. And it's how you message and how you get that point across. I think the fact that Trump is so polarizing, even with 25% of your own party, is the problem in that party. I mean, people are going to hold their nose, those 25% voting for him, but I don't know if these Senate candidates continue this way, that it's not going to rub the wrong way when Sherrod's on the ballot, because he's very popular with some segments of the independent voters.
So how much, Gene, does the top of the ticket of, say it is still Trump and Biden, both relatively speaking, unpopular.
Right.
They could drag each candidate down. Who drags the candidate down the least, I guess, is who wins, perhaps, if that's a factor.
It depends which U.S. Senate candidate emerges from that scrum. And when we were kids, we often played the game paper, scissors, rock. Okay, so Matt Dolan can beat Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown beats Bernie Moreno, and Donald Trump has beat Frank LaRose. Okay.
So who wins?
If it's Dolan, Dolan can beat Brown. If it's Moreno, he can't beat Brown because, well, okay. So we talk a lot on the show about there's good last names in politics: Brown, Kennedy, O'Neill. There's also bad last names, which is anything unfamiliar. Germanic last names are not good statewide. Okay, we're 33% of the population, but we're not a good last name. Moreno is unfamiliar.
How do we see that early voting starts in less than 2 weeks? Andrew, do we have any gauge on where we are? I mean, the Democrats are going after Moreno. Moreno is all over TV. His TV ads feature Donald Trump as much, if not more, than they feature himself. So he's obviously just beaten that Trump endorsement down.
Yeah, so like I said before in the show, I kind of make conclusions based on observing the actors and kind of what they do and infer what they think from that. And so by Democrats focusing on Moreno, by Moreno having Trump's endorsement, by LaRose attacking Moreno, and even to some extent Dolan attacking Moreno, kind of all of the attacks are aimed at Bernie Moreno. And so I conclude that people think he's leading. And we'll see where things go from there. The polls are quite close, and there's a lot of people who are undecided, so we'll see how it breaks.
Does any word on whether Donald Trump will make a campaign stop before the primary? He did in 22, like 3 weeks ahead, came out for J.D. Vance.
He hasn't called me about that yet.
No.
I asked around about that a
Any
little
word
bit.
from campaign folks?
So I asked around about it. Didn't mean I got answers. So, but certainly it's something that people are wondering because it makes a difference if he actually comes or not. There's sort of a spectacle that is associated with him showing up, and I think it does make a difference.
Yeah, and well, the trial has been delayed from March 4th, but the Supreme Court hearing this week, if it's decided quickly, there could be court proceedings in the week before, 2 weeks before the primary. We'll see. All right, our next topic. Every 2 years, the state legislature approves the capital budget, hundreds of millions of dollars for building projects all around the state. This year, there is an extra capital budget thanks to a surplus of money left over after the pandemic. It totals $700 million. This week, the House approved its half of the money. Among the projects it would help pay for is the proposed new performance space for the Columbus Symphony Orchestra. The state would contribute $10 million toward the $275 million project on the Scioto Peninsula. That's just one of the scores of projects around the state that would be funded by this. Brian Rothenberg, is this good use of government money, or is it old-fashioned pork barrel politics?
So I will tell you, it is good money because having come from a different state that I lived in for a few years and seen, how in Michigan and seen how they don't have the same level of capital funding or even road funding on their transportation budgets, this does actually help the economy. I will say this, first of all, anyone notice that Joe Biden helped pass that pandemic money and they complain about it, but now they're more than willing to spend it. But what's really entertaining, especially for our journalist friends here, is that the Republicans have adopted congressional style here. The current speaker, who needed Democratic votes to become speaker, has not given some of those projects, which are a gift, a Christmas gift basically, or holiday gift, to some of his opponents. Now, it's expected probably in the Senate, where his rival, who is going to challenge him for Speaker, the current Senate President, Huffman, will then give those projects back to those people that were deprived of those. It's just ridiculous that this Washington-style infighting is now in the State House too. It's just crazy.
Laura, as you look at that list of projects, I mean, is there any commonality? Are there any themes that develop, or is it just whoever could get the ear of a lawmaker to get their project on the list?
So yeah, like all this federal money that surged in, it caused the general revenue funds to really kind of swell, and they have this big pot of money that they wouldn't have otherwise. Usually the community projects is like 150 million. 700 million is a lot of money. And both the finance chairs of both the Senate and the House said that they hope that these projects are transformational, like really big ticket, big thinking. Mm-hmm. And you could argue there's like 315 projects on the House list. And you could argue that some of them are, kind of large scale, et cetera. Sure, but then others are very modest. Like there's like $150,000 for pickleball courts in Indian Lake. I don't know how transformational that is, although some people might find pickleball very transformational. But my point is that some of the projects are pretty small ball.
Transparency. We didn't get a look at the list until basically they were approved. Now it's not over yet. There's several more steps to this process, Andrew, but. Is this pretty typical for capital budgets?
There's usually a hearing on legislation before it's passed. So, I mean, the process at the legislature isn't always perfect, but it is unusual to see them introduce and pass something so quickly here. But, they had a schedule to keep, and I guess they wanted to get this out before the election.
Is spending this money, this one-time money, on capital projects the best use of this money? Why not give it back to the voters in the terms of like a refund? Doing the math, it'd be about $120 for each Ohio taxpayer if you were to dole this money out.
What you're really doing here is you're recognizing that this state has many areas that are winners and losers, that economic development here is not ladled around like soft butter on fresh toast, spread evenly. It's more like cold butter on Wonder Bread. And you have lots of areas of the state that need help. Also, what normally goes on with this stuff is the regional chambers of commerce traditionally play a huge role because they look together inside their own region and say, this particular project will be transformational and help spur other projects, other redevelopment, things of that nature. So that, and I was not in the room. By the way, none of these discussions on these capital bill issues have ever been transparent, but they've usually been congenial. Okay, that's the big difference. And I think that's really the story. And I'm not expecting this thing to ever actually pass until lame duck.
It'll pass before lame duck. The Senate president said that the Senate's not going to be rushed on this, that the House didn't collaborate with their chamber. But I think that the plan is to pass some sort of plan for this $700 million super duper fund by early to mid-June.
Usually, Andrew, when there's a lot of extra money, politicians get along, don't they? Not so much here with the whole drama over the speaker and possibly another speaker fight down the road.
Yeah, we've seen over the course of the last year plus, when this deal with Jason Stephens was first struck, you had Republican lawmakers who refused to vote for the minutes to be approved. I mean, there's just a lot of acrimony that's lingered, and as we've rolled into the next speaker's election, it continues to be a factor. I mean, the Ohio Republican Party has censured some of these lawmakers. They were fighting for party endorsements. The sitting speaker isn't going to have one, so, and then when you sort of just, everything flows downhill from there, and we're talking about the super duper fund, it makes sense that it's not so super duper.
Yeah, 19 Republican House members voted no on this. They were not allowed to speak when they were voting on it, and some, as Brian said, did not get projects because they had voted for.
Now they know how Democrats feel.
All right. Since Ohio voters passed Issue 1 in November and enshrined abortion rights in the Constitution, not much has really happened. Technically, Ohio's 6-week abortion ban is still on the books, but it is on hold because of a judge's ruling. That case is before the Ohio Supreme Court. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost has submitted a filing to the court in this case, basically saying it's up to them. But he also maintains that not all aspects of the so-called heartbeat law should be discarded. Laura Bischoff, before the Issue 1 vote, Yost said this is the end of the heartbeat law. Now he's saying, well, maybe we can save some of it. What's really going on here?
Well, I think Attorney General Yost was very clear saying that it would be unconstitutional if issue 1 passes. That was before November. Now, he's singing a different tune, and he's saying it's up to the judges to decide what aspects of the heartbeat law are constitutional or unconstitutional, as well as all the other abortion restrictions that are on the books. The lawmakers have signaled that they have no interest in wholesale repealing of these laws, so they're going to probably litigate it through the courts at every turn. The other thing that's happening is that Dave Yost is interested in running for governor, and I think that abortion rights is a big litmus test for Republican voters. I'm sorry, anti-abortion is right.
Yep.
Got it.
Right.
Anyway, I think that he needs to kind of plant his flag as a pro-life Republican and make sure that everybody knows that he's not going to just roll over on it.
Fight the fight all the way to the end.
Correct. Run through the tape.
Andrew, on this case, this case will just decide the heartbeat law, so-called, the cardiac activity law. It will not look at transfer agreements that are required of abortion clinics or 24-hour waiting period, all that stuff. This is just narrowly looking at this, or might they look at the other stuff?
I just would never say never with a judicial review. I just, I don't know what judges think about these kinds of things, but ostensibly they're just looking at this one particular law. And so I would imagine the more likely scenario would be that abortion rights supporters would have a strategy about which laws they want to challenge, and they'd wage that kind of piecemeal as opposed to looking for some uniform ruling. But honestly, I don't know how judges think about this kind of thing.
So how does this play out now? Ohio voters have had their say. They have come out pretty clearly in support of abortion rights, in support of the so-called Roe standard. Does that take the wind out of the sails of this issue as a campaign issue this year in Ohio?
I would think so, but your strengths are your weaknesses. So my strength is I have some experience about what goes on inside the State House, but I'm not sure how anything works down there. And I don't think anybody can make any predictions except things are going to continue to get more dysfunctional on areas that I never anticipated them ever getting dysfunctional on. So you're asking about this, the abortion stuff? I told my fellow Republicans in August, what you need to do very quickly is you need to go up on the ballot with something that says very simply, the state may regulate abortion except in cases of rape, incest, and the health of the mother. You regulate everything you want, but you'll still have a role. To which I was said, that's nice, they'll let the door hit you on your way out.
What do Democrats do? Do they point to this proposed or possible national abortion ban, so-called?
Well, I do think there's discussion of that at the national level, but I think that it's going to wind up in the courts. The Democrats and most people who support abortion rights spoke very loud and clear, over 60%. But I think what's more alarming right now is this dysfunction in the legislature. They don't seem to respect voters. They don't seem to respect what the voters have done. And they want to find and play a lot of games with this. And I think they're going to generate some voter anger over time.
Is there any talk of going back to the ballot as soon as this November? Because the legislature could do it themselves. They could have put another constitutional amendment on the ballot. Would they dare? Would that be just...
I don't think anytime
bad
soon.
move?
I don't think anytime soon. I don't think, I think that issue 1's passage, a lot of voters might think, okay, it's all settled. But honestly, it isn't, because I think it's going to be litigated law by law, restriction by restriction, and it's going to take a long time before it's all settled.
If you do a Venn diagram of what everybody thinks in the State House right now, just on my side, on the Republican side, there's almost no overlap. You can't get consensus on enough stuff right now.
Okay. Let's get to our final off-the-record parting shots, and we will start with Brian Rothenberg.
So as a native Clevelander, I can tell you that, yes, the Cleveland Browns are talking about building in another part of downtown where the old Ford plant was. It's going to wind up back downtown. They're not building a land bridge to nowhere. But this is all negotiations.
Will it be a dome?
I hope so. I was really cold at one of those games I went up to see.
Gene Krebs.
So we will probably see redistricting reform on the ballot. The similar plan in Michigan got 57% of the vote. we are not yet talking enough about the ramifications that when that passes here, and I've had some of people who know how things work. When you see 40% of the seats become purple, a whole lot of Republicans who have currently been trained to go through the current primary process can't win in those seats. And they are starting to recognize that now.
Andrew.
So I don't really know what his grander picture is here, but Joe Manchin, the West Virginia senator, is coming to Cleveland next Thursday morning for a breakfast at the City Club up there, and he's doing an afternoon with your colleague Karen Kassler down here in Columbus. So is he running for president? I kind of doubt it, but I'm sure he doesn't mind people wondering if he is.
A little testing of the waters. Laura.
So there was a development in the state teachers retirement system pension board struggle. Wade Steen was removed by the governor from the board a year ago and replaced. A magistrate in an appeals court said that the governor didn't have the authority to do so. So now that ruling is not final and binding, and the case is going to continue through the courts, but it does raise some interesting issues.
Well, the Supreme Court this week, of course, heard the Donald Trump, is he eligible to run for president in states like Colorado? And we heard live audio of the U.S. Supreme Court. Tremendously interesting, tremendously informative. It shows you how that court works, how deliberative they are, how thoughtful they are. It's too bad we can't get video to go with the audio. Maybe next time. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Continue the conversation on Facebook. Watch us anytime on your time at our website, wosu.org/COTR. We're also on YouTube and the PBS video app. For our crew and panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.